Today's video will be a presentation of the 2021 Codington County Board Survey results. The presentation will be led by Callie Schleusner, the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation at Benchmark Data Labs. This is a South Dakota-based nonprofit that helps business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and government leaders alike build surveys and other data collection methods to access credible and timely data. Services they offer are the analysis and the presentations of the data you collect, creating dashboards for those, interactive platforms, reports on them, and even bringing in training and doing training on the results from the survey. About the survey that will be presented today's video, it is a result of a Change Network grant. The Change Network is a year-long program where South Dakota and North Dakota residents can participate. Each participant is given $5,000 to assist in a project that will impact their community. The director of United Way in 2020 through 2021 was part of that program, which then led to this survey. And now Change Network is starting its 5th cohort in the fall of 2021. The survey was sponsored by Turback Law Office and Watertown Community Foundation. It was developed by Watertown United Way Benchmark Data Labs in partnership with the Change Network, and then sponsors such as the Chamber of Commerce also helped put the survey on.
So we had 117 people complete the survey. It's important to know that there was actually a couple of people that only answered one question, so we threw them out. They only answered one, they don't get to play. But of the 117 people, unique people that completed this survey, 40 shared information about the boards that they are on. And we did have to take out some of those because you might imagine a board member of an organization and a staff person of an organization might have answered the same questions. So we actually have 27 organizations represented in some of our data about like board bylaws, for example. 89 people shared demographic information. I don't think that everybody should have to share their demographic information, but it is important because it helps us identify gaps. And 92 shared their experiences of serving on a board. So that's sort of the breakdown, and none of these groups are mutually exclusive. You might serve on a board and work for an organization that has a board and share data about both of those things. So a couple of things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about who answered the survey. Women were much more represented in this survey than we have in the community. Usually communities are about 50-50, male-female. This survey was about a quarter male and 3/4 female. So that's important to note, but it kind of does look similar to this room. There's a little bit more women in the room than men, sorry gents. And people between the ages of 40 and 59 were a little bit more overrepresented than we see in Codington County. So I just took some data from the census to do that comparison. And only one person identified as any race other than white, which I think is important to note, because you do have a smaller minority population in terms of race and ethnicity in this county, but you do have people of different races, and that's important to note. Also, people that took the survey, probably unsurprising for the topic of the survey, had higher educational attainments than the average person in Watertown. So more people were likely to have at least some sort of associate's level education as compared to the rest of the county. So about half of the county have, over the age of 25, have higher than a high school diploma. And for this survey, we had about 78% of respondents. So higher educated folks are answering this survey. So, that being said, we have some limitations, right? I'm not going to share data with you and tell you just to trust me. I want to build that trust with you. So, I'm going to tell you the pitfalls of this data, right? And we just went over them. So, there's an underrepresentation of men and people of color, and an overrepresentation of the highly educated and those between that 40 to 59 year age bracket. I'm also going to be making some comparisons with some national data. This doesn't need to be interpreted that the national data is the best thing and you should rise to the national standard. We know that things work differently in South Dakota and things work differently in smaller communities. So please don't take that as advice. It's just a nice comparison to see sort of how you stack up toward the national average. I did take a lot of this comparison data from Leading with Intent. It's an index of nonprofit board practices. That's pretty cool if you're interested in some national studies. So, okay. Any questions before I move on about that? Okay, all right. So, how do boards work in Codington County? At least according to this survey, right? We know that not everybody's represented. So, of the 26 unique organizations we're talking about today, the data primarily at least comes from executive directors of these organizations. We did have some board members that answered, and we did have some other staff that answered questions. And these are the organizations that are represented for this section. I don't know if you can see any of yourselves in that list. But it's important. You can you're all going to get a copy of this by email, by the way. So if you were taking notes, you don't have to. All right. So 66% of boards in Codington County are what we would consider small. They have between 5 and 14 members. And this is compared to the national average, which is actually 16. I thought that was really kind of surprising. But when you start to think about larger organizations in large cities that have 40 or 50 or 60 board members, that average number goes up. I think it really just depends on the type of organization you are. If you're a full volunteer organization and you have 5 members, you can be just as effective as a large board with 14 members, and probably sometimes more effective because you have less people in the room when you're trying to make some decisions. And a quarter of these boards have at least one board opening that they are trying to currently fill. And of course, as you can imagine, the larger the board, the more likely they are to have a board opening. And this is probably not surprising to you, as many of you serve on boards. Most of these boards meet monthly. A very large percentage of them meet monthly. Some meet quarterly. And then there's sort of another category. About 15% meet somewhere between 2 and 11 times a year. So that's my other category there. Average number of board meetings for boards nationally is between 7 and 8 in a year. So, board terms and limits. Do you guys know what would you guess to be the average board term in this community? How long is somebody serving on a board for one term? 2 years. You guys are so smart. Great. Excellent. So 74% of boards in Codington County have some sort of defined board term. Not all of them do, but most of them are 3 years. Over half of them are 3 years. What about term limits? This is a little harder, right? Smaller communities, we don't have as many term limits. Actually, 67% of the organizations that responded didn't have any term limits. I have a hypothesis about that. I think in smaller communities, if you start doing term limits, you start losing people really fast. We all get recycled in small communities, and so if you said you could only serve on this board for 2 terms ever, you're kind of losing a pretty large part of the population pretty quickly. But it is important to note, compared to national boards, that only 24% of them have no term limits. So, board requirements. We ask people what they expect of their board members. And mostly this is just saying, please show up. Please show up to the board meetings. And still only 59% of organizations had at least some sort of formalized attendance requirements for their boards. How many of you have all of your boards meet all of the meetings? None, right? It's impossible. But we did have a couple of other requirements. 15% had some sort of fundraising or financial contribution requirements. And some had some event planning requirements. This other down here is for those that need to be elected to a board. For example, a school board. That's a requirement that they have to go through before that they can serve on the board as well. So, how do you find board members in Codington County, according to the survey? Most organizations rely on board and staff referrals. Shocker! Where else are we going to find people? So a couple of things to note here. Most of these referrals are coming from board members, which can lead to some self-selection bias in communities. That's important to note. If you have people and they're only recommending their friends, you're not going to get as many diverse perspectives in the room. So it's important to know that. Referrals from staff, also important. But I wanted to bring some national data to the table. A lot of board chairs in the nation talk about having difficulties finding board members. And the research suggests that the more specific you are about the diverse blends of skills, people group types, the easier board recruitment is. And so there's something actionable in that if you're having trouble finding board members, sitting down and thinking about who you want at the table, not as a person, but as a skill set or as a diversity component, that it's really important to define that as a board. How many of you have done that on your boards, defining what types of people you want? Couple? We just did that actually for our board. It was a 3-hour conversation. It was really long, but really helped us figure out who we needed to get on our board. Okay, so we asked people at Recruitment. This is a really messy, really overwhelming slide. Don't worry, I'm gonna move past it. We asked people to rank in order of importance what they were looking for in terms of finding board members. So, the most important. People want people who are really excited about the work they're doing, right? Shocking. This is a top 3 priority for 89% of the organizations represented in this survey. And also the most important thing nationally, you don't want somebody on your board who doesn't believe in the work that you're doing. 59% ranked the ability and willingness to donate time. People are valuing time way more than they value money, at least in this survey. I want people to show up. I want people to be able to volunteer. I want people to be able to donate their important skill sets as it relates to my work. I'm less interested in them just cutting me a check. And 33% ranked visionary traits and professional expertise as top priorities. Skills and professional abilities were ranked a little bit higher nationally, but right, you want somebody that not only has professional experience, but that can see the future for your community or your organization. Any of these surprising? No. Sometimes good data just tells you what you already know. All right, so least important. Educational attainment and the ability and willingness to financially contribute tied for one of the bottom 3 slots. These are also less important to national boards too. You're trending kind of with the country. People really aren't that concerned about if you have a degree or not, or what your degree is in. They just want you to be excited about the work that they're doing. This is where we start to diverge a little bit from the national trend, at least in Codington County. 59% ranked representing racial and ethnic diversity of the community in the bottom 3. This is sort of bucking the trend nationally. Nationally, people are really focused on getting racially and ethnic diverse boards to represent their communities, though it's probably more difficult here as we have a smaller minority population, but it is also really important to note. And the bottom slot, people really don't seem to care about your political connections when it comes to your board members. However, that might be a little different for some organizations. All right, so what is board participation? Who's serving on these boards? What are they doing? Okay, so of the people that took the survey, 50% currently serve on a board, and 68% have ever served on a board. And most people are in this category. Most people are serving on one board right now. How many of you are serving on one board? Just one. How many of you are serving on 2? 3? 4? Or more? How many more? Just 4? You don't
I
even
just
know.
show up when they tell me.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't even do that half the time.
He's trying to say he's kind of a big deal.
I just don't say don't. Go.
So, of the 29 people who are currently serving on more than one board, more than 50% served on at least one of the board. People that are young in this community, at least for this survey, are the most likely to be serving on more than one board, which is probably different than other communities in South Dakota. I would be very interested to know how this compares to places like Rapid City, where we don't have as many young people on boards. So you guys had an interesting trend here. People in their 40s were most likely to serve on 2 boards. It's important to note that. I don't know what you really do with that, but it is important to note. So I did want to say, some folks that are taking a break, we didn't ask them why they were taking a break. We just asked them to say that they were taking a break. But they did hint to it later on, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So over half of respondents have served on more than one board in their lifetime. And for the people that took this survey, I think it's important to note that 74 different organizations were served by these individuals currently, and over 135 over the course of their time spent as board members, which is an incredible amount of experience to bring to some of this data. Sometimes we get caught up in going, wow, only 100 people took the survey. That's really not a lot. But you have a lot of people that know a lot about the organizations in this community, and I wanted to note that before we move on. So I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to show you. Almost a quarter of the people that took this survey have served on 5 or more boards. So the people that are serving on boards, at least in this survey, are serving on boards all the time. And that's some of the reasons that we see people starting to take a break is you get board burnout, right? How many more meetings can you go to? How many more times can you give your time and not be home at dinner, right? So that's important to note, especially in small communities. How can you rejuvenate people that might have board burnout? And how can you bring new people to the table so you're not always having the same faces at these organizational tables? We did ask people their industry. Laura was really helpful in making sure we weeded out industries that don't serve here, so we didn't ask people. But we had 51 respondents that shared their industries for this work, and 16 industries were represented in this survey. A quarter of them, interesting to note, were from the financial sector. And I'm not sure if that's really representative of this community, considering how small the sample size was. But if we just looked at the data, it would say we really tap a lot of folks from banks to be on boards, more so than any other industry. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay, good to know, because sometimes those can vary very likely. Nonprofits give the next largest subsection. And then that other category is a big catch also. It always ends up being top 5 for any work I do. Everybody loves to be in the other category. Nobody likes to be defined in South Dakota. I see it all the time in my survey work. So, we also asked about board governance. How many people are not only serving on boards, but are in roles that demand a little bit more of their time or a little bit more of their input? And we had quite a lot of participation. So 63% of people have held at least one type of board governance position for an organization they serve, right? So it's how many of you have served on a board and not held a board governance position listed up here? A couple. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second. We did see a really important trend on this one. Guys, even though you really didn't take this survey, you still came out on top. Most men that took this survey have held some sort of not only governance position, but executive governance position. Only about half of the women did. And that's, I didn't do the statistically significant test, but it kind of is telling that men are in much more higher positions on these boards than women, even though more women took this survey. So it's important to know that there might be some gaps there in who's getting to that chair or vice chair position. How many of you have served in the chair or vice chair position? So we also asked people to identify as a minority if they felt comfortable doing that. I know at least in demographic territory in South Dakota, we don't always like answering that question. People feel like it's a little bit of an invasive one, so we wanted to let people identify the way that they wanted to. So we did have 13 people that answered this survey identify as a minority, and most of them have already served on boards. And most of these, what we would consider a minority, are in the military and veteran category themselves. We did have some early career professionals, some that were disabled, one low-income household, and one ethnic minority and one racial minority. So you're not getting as many of the diverse perspectives on the racial and ethnic side, and that's probably, at least to me, not surprising because it seems to be less of an important issue in this community from the survey results. But 9 of these folks have also served in these governance positions too, so it's important to note that is not the same across the country. Who is not participating on boards, right? We know a lot about who's participating on boards, who's not participating on boards. We had 37 people said that they have never served on a board, and most of them have not served on a board because they weren't asked. And that's important to note. Most of these industries were in education, healthcare, and nonprofits. Those were more service-oriented sectors. And many of them are highly educated, at least having a bachelor's degree. There are a couple of folks that did say they got burned by a board. They didn't want to participate anymore. But nobody was not participating in a board because of a bylaw or a conflict of interest. I think that's important to note, that you don't have a lot of structural barriers to people participating in boards in this community. So, good job. So, you guys probably already know the answer to this. What do people want from the organizations they serve as a board? This is the actionable part, hopefully, for Laura here. Board members across the board, across all different types of organizations, said they had a lack of formal onboarding procedures for the boards they served on. This leads to a lot of confusion. We had a whole space that we're going to talk about in a minute of people telling us what didn't happen when they joined an organization. But as you can see in this chart here, a lot of organizations, so we asked people of the organizations you have ever served on, we want to try to cast our net as wide as possible, how many have done some sort of mandatory in-person orientation or training, and over half of them don't do anything in terms of that mandatory in-person training. Some organizations do share some sort of orientation manual or documents, but still, again, close to half of these organizations aren't doing that at all. Some folks do have some sort of informal orientation. How many of you have gone through a formal orientation for a board? Sitting down with the CEO or the president to go over your board role, for example. Couple, but okay, so we see that that might lead to some confusion down the road. So we asked board members what they want. They want that confusion to be cleared up quickly and clearly. Many of them, we asked this as an open-ended question, so everybody was allowed to say as much as they wanted about this topic, and we got some really, really good information that when you open this PowerPoint at home, you'll add all of those comments on the bottom part. So people want physical, tangible things that they can look at and review to know what they're supposed to do for your organization. That includes an orientation manual, board expectations, and they want to talk to you. They want to talk to these people in person to say, tell me what you want from me. We did also have about 20% needing some sort of meeting facilitation guidance. Some of us who participated in 4-H or other organizations know a little bit more about Robert's Rules, but some folks don't feel comfortable or don't feel like the organization they serve right now does a good job of adhering to Robert's Rules. So that's an important thing to think about. So, some recommendations that come from this too. And these recommendations, I will say, are by and large driven directly from the comments that come from this survey. Board members want community trainings and resources for board best practices. So that includes templates for orientation manuals. I not only want to know what I'm getting into, but I want the organization that I'm working with to have a leg up in providing that kind of material. Robert's Rules, like we just talked about. How to effectively communicate history and hierarchy of an organization. This is something that came up time and time again, is that people wanted an orientation manual because they didn't understand the history of the organization that they were serving. They wanted to know more about that legacy, more about what went well, what didn't. I know in the nonprofit world, it's really hard for us sometimes to take a step get done, but your board members certainly want that. A number of people mentioned strategic planning trainings or resources. So once people are on boards, they want a little bit more guidance on how to make their boards and their organizations more successful. And ensuring diversity in board representation. This is really important. You don't want to just make decisions for people, you want to make decisions with people. And that means having a diverse group of decision makers in the room, even if they aren't what you would quantify as a traditional leader. That's really important as we're starting to talk about particularly social service nonprofits. I think in the state and nationally, you want to have people that represent the community that is benefiting from your services at the table to make those decisions so that you don't mess up. That voice is really, really important. And so arming boards with an idea of how to ensure that diversity and figure out what that appropriate diversity looks like for their board is very important. Second, no-brainer here, right? But establish and then communicate. You can establish them, but if they sit on the shelf, no one will know what they're supposed to do as a board member. So an explanation not only of board member roles, but also staff roles. Where do you work with staff directly? Where does the staff bring you information versus you getting the information yourself? Those are really important. I know I've served on a number of boards and I never got even a job description of the executive director when I was supposed to do annual evaluations. That's really important. I don't even know what they're supposed to do as a board member because I wasn't told what success looks like. And also expectations of board members with examples. A number of people said, I don't just want to know what I'm supposed to do, I want to know who did it before me and what they did well. A lot of people really want communication with past board members, which I found to be a really, really interesting finding, is that people are so invested in the legacy of these organizations that they want to talk to previous board members about what went well and what didn't go well. And I think a number of people said they want to know what went well more than they want to know what didn't go well. And of course, I'm a huge data nerd, so I always push for this. The more data we have, the better our decision making will be. So I would recommend expanding this survey, not just here in Codington County, but I would love to see this statewide because I think that as a state, this would benefit us and our organization so much to get us all on the same page about what's out there. So with that, that's the end. You've all been very patient. I very much appreciate it.